Hello, everybody, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the Rant Zerker. We are on Rant Zerker number 153, if my memory serves. No, 135. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. Damn, 135. And we're gonna be looking at. Oh, I'm here with Teal Deer. Welcome. Thanks for coming on, Teal Deer.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay.
You feeling okay? Doing well? Yeah.
Next question.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time regardless. So I wanted to look at this. I don't know if I would call it a study. It's an article, sort of like a paper. It has citations and references that's on ResearchGate. So it's like a research paper. And the gentleman who wrote it, his name is Steve Moxon, and it's entitled, and this is why I wanted to look at it, it's entitled, "Misogyny Has No Scientific Basis of Any Kind. The Evidence is of Phylogeny." And phylogeny is the love of women. Because I haven't heard that before. But funny that I've heard the word misogyny so many times that it just sounds like white noise to me. But I've never heard phylogeny before. It up. And
seems fair.
What was that?
Seems fair.
Yeah.
We don't discuss a whole lot of, people actually like women. It's like, but they do though. So
yeah, they do. Well, this is the thing that I have been thinking about a lot lately, and I'd like to get your impression of this. But so this study talks about, and we'll get into some of the, details and stuff of the study. This research paper talks about, or makes the argument that misogyny, there's no scientific basis for it as an idea, as at least not as an idea in the way that it's presented by most people. I wouldn't even say feminists, just like the average person, when they discuss misogyny, they're talking about something that's very severe, but it's used extremely haphazardly and casually. And so it either never had meaning or it's lost meaning. And I think that this kind of framing of interactions between people, whether it's men and women, blacks and whites, Muslims and Christians, whatever it is, right? There is a weapon called, a lot of people call them isms, that are just thrown at people, and I don't think that they're actually defining reality like 99% of the time. And so instead, if it's the case that misogyny isn't real, like it doesn't really exist, or at the very least it certainly doesn't exist to the degree that we use the term, then what is the purpose of the word if not to obscure or sort of detract away from actual, acts that we would deem to be immoral or violent or hateful? Do you see what I'm saying?
well, yeah, it's basically just shaming language, browbeating, forcing people into some sort of ideological submission. Pretty much it.
Yeah.
Because whenever you look at any sort of claim of misogyny or anything like that that attempts to quantify it, it always comes up lacking. So from a psychological perspective,
Yeah.
when we look at the psychology of men and women and their general attitudes towards men and women when it comes to both intersexual dynamics and intrasexual dynamics, we always find that men, when it comes to other men and women, their general position on men is actually fairly neutral, with a positive association for women. So that is, most guys view other guys as just kind of whatever, but they view women as being more important. And very interestingly about that is it's something that modulates with age. Men display sort of a neutral in-group dynamic when it comes to other men when they're younger, or sometimes very slightly positive. but as they become older, basically post-pubertal, it almost always goes to outgroup preference. And women just have an in-group preference. They view the interesting thing about when it comes to women on aggregate is they have an aggregate in-group preference. But their outgroup preference for men is either neutral or in some cases touching very slightly against, but that's somewhat rare. It's usually neutral. So basically, I mean, that's just from base psychological research that's been done on humans, like over the past 40 years. And this is stuff which, has been replicated repeatedly. And as far as I'm aware, this is a lot of what this paper goes into. And you dig into all sorts of things about society and how it looks at men and how it looks at women and how it treats them and how it cares more about one than the other. And you look at things like women, obviously we know that they receive disproportionate welfare spending, disproportionate medical spending, disproportionate all of this compared to issues that men face. You look at other social things, so regarding like violence and crime, men are more likely to receive than women. Threat assessment, women are more likely to perceive threat than men, probably because most men see a lot of other things as neutral, whereas women don't. And women are more likely to perceive themselves as being victims of things than men are, even though men are disproportionately more likely to be victim of it. And all of this stuff basically puts together, you just sort of see how humans operate. I mean, we can also throw into that the known hierarchical effects that humans have, where males sort of do this hierarchical jostling, and we know that this is something because this is that they do because it's associated with not only the serotonin system, but it's also linked to the testosterone system as well. That is, when men succeed at certain things, they will receive serotonin and bumps in testosterone as well. And times when they are sort of lowered in a hierarchy position, if they're actively competing and not just going along with it, they will get an associated drop with that. Now, women don't have such a complex. It is complex, but it's not in the same sort of way in that it's directly tied to where they are in relation to the hierarchy like that. Men's hierarchies tend to fall into categories or areas of interest or expertise, whereas women's tends to be more like a horizontal spread across everything, and this is how men and women modulate their relationships with each other. Again, this is sort of generally speaking. And you look at all of this sort of stuff, and it's like, okay, so we clearly have these very hardwired biological underpinnings. That they are sociobiological underpinnings to how human beings work as animals. Some of it is obviously, we have a degree of modulation regarding society and environmental stimulus, but a lot of it is hardwired. And no amount of human interaction as just a social construct is going to change how your serotonin system interacts with a certain stimulus. Like if your body didn't have the potential to produce, uptake, and distribute serotonin, that wouldn't happen, yet it does. And obviously, we talk about the biological aspect of this. We know that there are implicit differences between male and female as discrete biological entities, which they are. Things such as male upper body strength, respiratory capacity, and whatnot compared to female average, female need for gestation, and all this stuff. You put all this stuff together, and it's kind of like, obviously, with all of this data, you can see women on aggregate better at identifying danger, more sensitive to danger, more we need to be protected, and lots of social stuff going out horizontally with all these networks. And men, it's just like, oh, we can do things, and we like women coincidentally, which is also the sex that has to do with the gestational thing and whatnot. And it's like when things like this are all tied so intricately to how your species reproduces and the base biology of your species, can't avoid the fact that it's like there is no way this species would work if
Mm-hmm.
the one half hated the other irrationally and just wanted to abuse and oppress them. Like, there is no way that this
Right.
would work.
Nope. It couldn't possibly.
Which is a very long way of, which is just a very sort of long-winded way of saying, like, when you talk about, like, misogyny and whatnot, you're dealing with this very abstracted concept,
Mm-hmm.
which, in the abstract, yes, could be true, insofar as there are some people out there who have an irrational dislike or distrust of some characteristic. And we know that because there are, all the other ists and phobes that people throw out. You're the hater of women, the hater of men, the hater of blacks, of whites, of browns, of
Gays,
yellows, of reds, of
trans
blues,
people.
whatever.
Yeah, whatever it is.
It's like there is this abstract possibility of someone just blindly not liking, hating, distrusting whatever some group of people based on that. However, what you are often looking at when you find people who actually genuinely hold that sort of viewpoint, and we're looking at single-digit percentage at most, probably not even a full percentage point of people who actually genuinely have a blanket consistent distrust of one characteristic of people, because that's what these charges are.
Yeah.
And those fraction of 1% of people that actually hold that, 90-something% of the time, there is going to be some sort of either trauma reason, some sort of pathological reason, or some sort of reason that they've come to that. It's because otherwise you're dealing with effectively psychopathy, which is potentially how some of it is going to be explained, because we're talking about such a small number of people. But, it's like, what's the favorite thing that you keep hearing whenever anyone brings up anything? It's like, who hurt you?
Who hurt you?
It's like, who hurt you? Why can't you just go get laid? Just do all of this stuff, virgin basement dweller, neck. It's like, okay, well, if what you're saying is true, then maybe that is the reason for this person to be developing and displaying these negative traits. Like, if someone consistently receives negative attention or negative focus, I mean, what do you expect to be the response to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, it's going to be negative, inevitably, because it can't be. Like, you can't run into a brick wall or something like that forever and just keep smiling through it. Eventually, people just give up and become jaded about it. Like, it's impossible to not happen.
Right. And it's almost, and the thing is too, this is the reason why I don't find that the word misogyny has a lot of utility. It actually turns out that the misogyny is trying to describe a social phenomenon or a sort of state of being of an individual or even a group of people, because the assertion is, that patriarchy is misogynistic and therefore men are misogynistic. Or sometimes it just targets a man. Oh, MGTOWs are misogynistic, for example. But the problem with that is the truth is it's unknowable. And most of the time, when people feel a certain way, whether they are, batshit crazy, angry feminists that want to, use the state to essentially turn men into a slave class so that they can redirect funds to women. And yes, that is what many feminists want to do, or whether they know it or not, or if they are, sort of angry incel types that will tell you that they're angry at women. But what it isn't that. It's usually something very personal. It might have something to do with the way they were brought up by their mother or their father, or maybe a lack of those things. But it doesn't really add up when you look at an individual's response, even if they have a disgust response to another person or group of people based on a singular trait, like you were saying. That doesn't really explain enough, because it doesn't make sense to, unless again you have some kind of disorder, it doesn't actually make sense to feel that strongly about every person that has a certain, characteristic that you have a problem with. It's almost always something personal. So in a way, the who hurt you thing does seem to make some sense, but it's also projection, because I think that that's, ultimately what you're dealing with when feminists say who hurt you, sweetie. They're really, sort of revealing something about themselves.
I think some of it is projection, or it's just belittling. It's just, I'm just going to use this as a means of dismissing what I consider to be your bad behavior. It's like, oh, who hurt you? It's basically just get over it, stop showing your emotions about it.
Yeah.
Because that's one thing I hate about that phrase. Yeah, because so much of it is basically, it's like, oh, well, who hurt you? It's like, okay, well, this person. What about this person? This other person? This other person? Yeah, what now? It's like, okay, so where are you going to go with this? It's like, maybe this person has a reason that they express these emotions. Like, people's emotions tend to not just manifest randomly out of nowhere. There's usually some sort of stimulus. Now, we can potentially look at the stimulus and say, well, is your emotional response going to be considered proportional to the stimulus? We can debate that forever, but there is normally a reason for it.
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't want to get too caught up in that, but I've been thinking about this mostly because I've been talking a lot about critical race theory, and there is a through line with a lot of these sort of leftist talking points, which essentially create oppressor classes and oppressed classes along various different axes in order to essentially try to gain power. That's all this is about at the end of the day. So when I think about it in those terms, I don't find that the term misogyny is very useful. And what's interesting about it is, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, being so in the eyes of feminists and maybe the normies that sort of blue-pilled normies that take on the narrative, in the eyes of these people, being a misogynist is worse than being a criminal. Or just doing evil things, like actions. They actually take a step back. This is the reason why you can find, that if you call a woman a cunt and she responds, and it could be for no reason, it doesn't really matter why. But let's say you just called a woman a cunt on the street, and then that woman pulls a gun out and shoots you. There will be people that will say that the guy who called a woman a cunt deserved it, because misogyny is more severe than murder or assault or something, right? And I think that what has happened is, over time, we have conditioned people to believe that bigoted statements, words, even if they are bigoted, even if they are extremely unpleasant, severe insults, whatever, that they are far more egregious than physical assault. In fact, that they should be responded to with violence, and that makes it okay. So, and it's along very specific lines. This is the reason why when in the UK there was all this talk about making misogyny a hate crime, just misogyny, which I don't even know how you define. How can you know when it's taking place? But they're talking about making it a hate crime, and I think they started with things like catcalling and harassment in Nottinghamshire, and there were some politicians, MPs, and MRAs in the UK that said, well, if you're going to make misogyny a hate crime, you have to make misandry a hate crime too. And I was like, no, this is a terrible idea. Please don't do this, because if you go down this road, number one, you should not be making anything hate crimes. Because this goes back to something that's a little bit more universal. There's just crime. If you adding hate to the front of it doesn't make the crime worse. That's like saying if somebody committed mass murder and killed 100 people with, I don't know, by crashing an airplane into a building or setting off a bomb, but he wasn't ideologically motivated in any way. He was just I just don't like people. He was just a misanthrope. That somehow would be less severe than if someone killed maybe a single individual or a smaller group of people for ideological reasons, like maybe they were women and he hated women, for example, as an example. They would say that that crime, even though it does less harm to fewer people, is more severe than the one that did more harm to more people. So I was like, no, you can't, you got to throw out the whole concept of hate crime for that reason alone. But then secondarily, even if you did put it through, there is no way in hell that that will be applied in a just way, because of a number of factors. Like, women are more likely to find things misogynistic because they're more programmed to be more sensitive, and they are generally more sensitive to things that they find offensive, so they're more likely to find things misogynistic, whereas men are less likely, in fact probably not likely at all, to find things or misandric. They might simply say, well, this is just what it is to be a man, like I'm not gonna sweat it. And if you brought it up to them, they would probably say, what the hell is misandry? So you see what I'm saying? That those are my thoughts.
That's actually something that's been studied, men and women and how they perceive sexism. It was basically women will perceive things as sexist kind of at the drop of a hat, but in order for a guy to see a woman as being sexist, like, it has to be dialed up to 11. Otherwise, he's just going to be like, whatever.
It would have to be.
I can't remember who did it, but it might be referenced in this paper. Actually, I haven't checked all the citations for this one. It might be in here.
It's so sexist.
Oh yeah, Allison is here. Let me just put her up on the.
I'm just being an asshole. Don't worry about
it. No, it's okay. So, like, I'll give you an example. I played a little clip. Very short clip before the show started, and there were some angry feminists in the comment section, as trivial as this would be, but it was essentially a clip from the old He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon. Okay, and I want to show you guys really quick, so give me a second. I'll play it here, but I just had to go into YouTube. This sort of like sort of describes what I'm talking about. Okay. So, do you guys see that? You just enter my OBS so you can see it. So this is just a 6-second clip. Okay, you can see it. All right.
She's fainted.
Just like a woman.
Okay, so.
Skeletor says it is.
So they kidnap like Princess Aura and she faints, and then they tell him, because Beastman has to point out the obvious, and Skeletor says just like a woman, and people in the comments are there's some people that are pretty fucking upset that he would dare to say that, and I'm like, yeah, but this is Skeletor. You know what I mean?
He's a bad guy. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're lucky that's all he said.
The bad guy is doing bad guy things. Oh no.
Also, how is he wrong? I think Skeletor's spitting facts.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you see that's the thing. So Skeletor is a villain. He's basically a megalomaniac. He's a conqueror. If it wasn't a kid show, it would probably be more. He'd probably be more psychopathic, and he's literally like a lich. Like he's like some evil undead entity. And the concern people had is that he made a statement about women, stereotyping them as just oh, it's so typical that they would faint because they're so emotional or whatever, And it's funny because the women who are mad are also on their fainting couches, because Skeletor made this statement. So it basically sort of describes what I'm saying. It's like misogyny, or perceived misogyny, because again, the word is, I would say 99% of the time it's misused, is more severe than actual, wrong or evil, or whatever word you want to describe. I know evil for some people seems a little too black and white moralizing, but you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think what we need is, for YouTube comment sections, we need Skeletor's law. Is any mad hose in the comment section on a Skeletor video just proves the need for more Skeletor.
Yeah, there you go. Skeletor's law. Any arguments against Skeletor just proves the need for Skeletor.
How dare Skeletor say women faint?
Exactly.
I need to faint.
So
Oh my
it's so
Lord.
good though. 6 seconds and the reaction in the comments section of women going no. I'm just like you're exactly what Skeletor's talking about. Just
Definitely
like a woman.
disproving the notion that women are more likely to find things offensive and to get emotional about it. So, yeah, you guys are really disproving that. Can't remember if it was Pew or Demos study. Yeah, you guys are really helping disprove, reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's
Okay.
look at the study. Or the it's not a study, I'm sorry. It's a I guess just a research paper. So this gentleman that wrote this, Steve Moxon, I actually emailed him today and asked him if he would like to be a guest on the show so we can talk a little bit more about his paper, and he agreed. So I'm going to be talking to him next Monday about this paper. Should I read the abstract or do you have like something that you want me to jump to? I did read through it, and I think he makes a good case. The only thing is, I think that a lot of people don't. They may not be ready for this because it challenges something pretty like frightening for the average person, right? Like even a lot of MRAs like wouldn't essentially make the statement that misogyny has no scientific basis of any kind. The evidence is of phylogeny and misandry. He actually adds and misandry to that, which I'm not sure I agree with. And I know that seems weird, but I'm not sure I agree with it. Because I don't really think feminists I don't think they hate men. But that's just me. What were you going to say?
No, I don't know. I don't know. I think there's a fair number of them that do.
The way I see it is, I think that feminists, even those that claim they hate men, they actually hate. And I don't mean to say this to be dismissive or to sort of minimize it. And I know that that maybe like how they feel about men doesn't matter as much as how the kind of policies they push for and the kind of cultural upheaval that they have created hurts men. So at the end of the day, it's sort of irrelevant whether or not they hate them because they are doing a lot of harm to them. But I think that it's usually very personal. Like I think that they have a love-hate relationship with their father. A lot of the time, whether because he wasn't there or because he was, and his mother and their mothers turned them against him. I think that is almost always the case, and because it's so irrational to fear and hate an entire group of people that I guess maybe I'm being really charitable by saying I don't think it happens that frequently. And I think there are the academic feminist types that I believe they also don't really hate men, but they find that this rhetoric, the feminist rhetoric, is useful to get them power and money, and so they do it. So it's really like they either feel that men have too much and they want some of it, sort of like the same way that the proletariat felt about the bourgeoisie, but just altered down the line of being men and women. Because a lot of times people who are poor and that complain about the rich, almost always, they're actually people who just want to be rich. So it's not like they hate the rich because they're rich, because those people want to be rich. So I think that feminists who claim they hate men and they want to they want their power, they don't really hate men. They just want what men have or what they think men have. And I think one of the things they have to do to make that work in their own brains is essentially erase or otherwise minimize all of the problems that men face and pretend like they're not important, which is why they engage in a lot of this sort of dismissive language like "who hurt you, sweetie."
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know. If you don't agree, it's okay. It's just my theory.
There are some who hate men.
Yeah, there are some, I think. Yeah,
I think a lot of them just use the fact that people's emotional hang-ups, or not hang-ups, but they're just their emotional makeup. The reason why people want to keep the word misogyny is because people care about women so much.
Yes.
that they want to be in constant vigilance over the possibility that somebody doesn't care. And the funny thing is that misogyny is a moving target, because if you can show that you care about women, and a person is like, well, I care about women, I give women all the respect they could possibly eat. And then the next person's like, well, that you must dislike women, because not only do I give women all the respect they could possibly eat, I give women the means to exist without having to be in a relationship with a man. And then the third person's like, oh, you don't care about women at all. I give women the means to exist without a relationship with a man, and I also give them every possible fantasy that they could possibly ever want. So the bar keeps raising every single time. So misogyny is not being able to give women what they haven't asked for yet, if that makes sense. Like, it's like,
yeah, that's yeah, I did a video about that years ago. It was the one about oppression, inflation. We can just keep giving women more and more rights because rights are only limited by your imagination, and so we can just keep printing this, and just keep inflating that currency regardless.
Yeah. And then anything up to the latest thing that you've given women is hatred of women. So that's why every society before our own society was absolutely and utterly driven by the blackest, most burning and acidic hatred of all women.
Yeah. My grandfather bought his wife a vacuum cleaner because he hates her. Meanwhile, she was like, no, he bought me a vacuum cleaner because I didn't want to have to pull all the carpets up, hang them outside, and pummel them for hours a week. This thing turned that into like an hour-long job once a week. It was amazing. It was labor saving. It was time saving. It cost a lot of money. It was great.
Yeah, but why didn't he vacuum for her? You know, like, why didn't he add that extra hour onto his 12-hour shift? Yeah. He could have just done more, you see. And that the thing is that men can always do more. So so misogyny is like a place, it's like a, you know how parents will draw how tall their children get. Misogyny is like, yeah, we got to this point in terms of benefiting women. Anything below it is now misogyny. It's like it's just hold your place. You know what I mean? Just to hold it's to indicate what the line between what is and is not misogyny, or what it does and does not benefit women. And if you don't get up to the new line of what isn't misogyny, then you're a misogynist. So it just keeps going higher and higher and higher and higher. And people want that concept because they want to feel like they're doing something. Like, men want to feel like they're saving women. So they want the idea. I mean, if you get rid of the idea of misogyny, then where do these guys get their identity? Where?
Right.
Of saving women.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, it broadens that, because I think there was probably, for most of human history, I don't think we use the word. In the study here, in the research paper, I'm sorry, I keep saying study, it's not a study. In this paper, the author does say that, misogyny is an ancient Greek term. So I guess it goes back, but I would guess that the way it was used back then, he says it was coined along with misanthropy to denote an unusual antisocial attitude. So misogyny, even according to this paper, was rare in ancient Greece, but they needed a word for it because I guess it did, something like that did come up. And it came with misanthropy, which was probably more common. Because, I mean, like, I don't know, like how, because somebody said in the chat, by the way, that, it's also a fear of women, fear and or hatred of women. I think the fear, and then they said that the Oxford Dictionary has changed it, so the word fear is no longer included, which probably means it makes it more emotionally charged, because the idea that there are people who exist that hate women is enough to motivate men and women to guard against that. It stops
you being the victim. Because if you're a misogynist because you fear something, then you're the victim of the circumstance, potentially.
Yeah.
As opposed to if you that from the definition, then you're the instigator, you're the hostile party.
Mm-hmm. Although I believe that hatred comes from fear, and so like you would have to feel as though, you know, because like by default we are, like, if we're not surrounded by things that we need to fear, we're pretty comfortable, and so there's no need to hate anything. But if you find that something is a threat, or can be, either for cultural reasons or whatever, like maybe you have a fear of dogs, it could easily, I think, morph into an irrational hatred. I think they're pretty much connected. You know, I think one leads to the other. But yeah, it doesn't have the same emotional manipulation that just using hate make it fear. They might have sympathy. So, because they might want to understand, you know, like if a child was abused by his mother or raped by his aunt, and he grows up to be distrustful of women, we'll just call it misogyny. And that's one of the things that's really convenient about misogyny. If you call someone misogynistic, despite their history, and that's not an uncommon thing, you know, to have been beaten by your mom or raped by a relative, a female relative, an older cousin or an aunt. This is very common in the Black community. It happens a lot. And if we like observe a person's behavior as they get older and find that they mistreat women, or are not good enough to them, or use them for sexual pleasure or whatever, we may call that misogynistic. But when you do that, what happens is the curiosity ends, because now we have given this man a label, and now we don't need to understand where it comes from. And anyone who tries to say, hey, let's learn about this guy's history. How did he get to this point? What did he, you know, what were his experiences? That then you are contributing to the misogyny by expressing sympathy, which is verboten. That's what the purpose of the word is in that context, in my opinion. Right? It exists to like silence people. It doesn't exist to encourage conversation and understanding. It's a
yeah. Because why would you want to understand people who hold a position that you consider to be irrational? It's like, why try to understand that? You know, just slap a label on them, call them a heretic, and they'll be done with it. Let the ostracization continue. You know, who cares about doing the psychological thing of the therapy thing of understanding it? Just like, okay, that's your position. Why? Explain.
Okay, so anyway, so back to the paper. So there's a section where he basically goes into the etymology a little bit. In the abstract, I'll just read the abstract for you guys. No published science paper demonstrates misogyny exists. Data on both implicit and explicit gender attitudes shows males substantially favoring females, phylogeny, or at worst, gender neutrality. This is hidden by Elysian, I hope I pronounced that right. That's a weird. With the wider notion of sexism. But there's no evidence for hostile sexism, and the hypothesized benevolent sexism is fatally flawed in operational definition. The mode whereby sexism supposedly causes harm, which is stereotyping, has been debunked. Likewise, intersexual dominance, removing any theoretical basis. Possible male harm by control is belied in women being found the controlling party. Misogyny / sexism in being defined circularly is unfalsifiable. Therefore, non-specific conceptualization. Ideology itself actually hostile sexism, misandry, which is shown to be real but unseen. So, do you want me to keep going, or do you want me to jump it to anything?
Well, I'm not exactly sure about the. I think this might be a literature review, but you know, there's some aspects of this paper, and I'm not saying that it's wrong, but it just sort of jumps out at me as being a little bit questionable. I know that it says things that we want to agree with, and I do agree with the premises of it, but it seems like this is more like an opinion piece. I'd have to look a lot closer at it, though. That makes sense. Like, I just don't want to. I want to look at this with at least some rigor. So I'm actually, because I know Teal Deer does spend a lot of time investigating these kinds of academic studies. Would you say this sort of passes the sniff test, or for some reason it's raising my hackles up, and it's not. It's like I said, I agree with the concepts in it. I'm worried that this is not presented in a way that's really valid. I don't know.
Mostly, I'd be more interested in looking at the actual journal that it's in.
Yeah.
I mean, it's come from newmalestudies.com, which, of course, by name alone might be like, maybe there's an ideological bias there or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. New Male Studies. I think that's actually that actually is a bunch of psychologists and researchers have come together to create a body of work, or so I am actually familiar with New Male Studies. Like they're outside of the current academic regime when it comes to works about gender, etc. So in that sense, that actually gives me that makes me feel like it's probably more legitimate.
Okay.
Yeah, like I'm glad you said New Male Studies, because I know where that's coming from. However, they are definitely outside the current academic orthodoxy when it comes to looking at and talking about men, which explains the subject matter of this particular I think it's probably a literature review, but let me take a look at it. Continue, Brian.
All right.
I wanted to discuss that.
That's okay. Just because we're looking at the study doesn't mean that we're necessarily like buying into this 100%. And this is actually the reason why I wanted to get the guy who wrote this paper on the show to talk to him about it. He does have a lot of sources listed. And the fact that it doesn't come from within the ivory tower, I understand why that might give people pause, but you also realize that most of what comes from the ivory tower is fucking awful. It's terrible, because it is in a kind of bubble, and that's how you get, like, you know, the feminist water lily and like legit papers about, you know, dog rape and stuff. So crazy things like that, right? Somebody in Australia wrote a thing about, you know, using different sex toys, and just wild things. So I'm reminded of a guy, I can't remember his name, but he talked about how, you know, science, most of the time, if there are like new ideas that deserve exploring, and I'm not saying this is science, but it comes from the fringe, right? Because the people in academia, they get used to a certain way of seeing the world that comes from their most accredited people, and then they sort of regurgitate that into each other's mouths for, you know, multiple years, and then unless someone is allowed to come in from the outside with new info that might change that, that's all that's going to happen there. So I get what you're saying. So he is reviewing literature, he's reviewing other papers, and essentially looking at all of the papers that make claims about the existence of misogyny and the evidence that they have. And he basically is saying that none of the evidence that's being presented in papers that are trying to make the case for the existence of misogyny or presume the existence of misogyny in order to make some other point, like about rape culture or, you know, something else, there's no evidence for it. He's like, the evidence that they have is weak. They haven't been able to produce anything that presents it, and in fact, you know, he wants to make an argument to the reverse. So I'll read another paragraph, and then, like, if you want, I can jump to. I'll tell you what the sections are called, where he demonstrates everything. But this is sort of like putting out what his, I think, what he's planning to discuss. So, exhaustive literature search produces no science paper, journal published or otherwise, on the topic of misogyny demonstrating its existence. No science paper shows, however differently labeled, generic, profound antipathy or hatred towards women by men. So he's even working with a slightly broader definition, because he calls it antipathy. I think having antipathy towards women is not hating women. So he's even working under a broader definition. As misogyny nowadays generally is understood, both in popular currency and as an explanation in social psychology and other academic literature, this is a relatively new ideological conceptualization. Formerly, the common understanding, still current, was/is that some individuals of both sexes may hold in contempt the opposite sex in general, typically through such as a series of failed romances. An ancient Greek term, misogyny, was coined along with misanthropy to denote an unusual antisocial attitude. Tellingly, there was not even mention of misandry, let alone noting it as either unusual or that it was considered antisocial. The ancient Greeks had no such word. According to the Oxford Dictionary, there is no record of its usage until the late 19th century. This is misandry, by the way. The presumption, without, if not contrary to evidence, that the ancient Greeks were misogynistic likely stems from the current understanding that historically women were held to be inferior in some respect. Latterly, the dissemination of feminist thinking has led to this being considered a form of misogyny, but it seems not to be the case, as is outlined here in Introduction to the Topic before beginning an examination of the scientific literature. So there's a presumption that the ancient Greeks, by feminist academics, that the ancient Greeks were misogynistic because they had the word misogyny in their vocabulary. Which, of course,
and that women were considered to be inferior. And he talks later about how women's role and what they contribute to society is it's not something that really can be argued. And there's no correspondence with men. So, child conception, pregnancy, lactation, that kind of stuff, they're contributing to the production of citizens for society is pretty much, and there's no corresponding thing for men. At least this is what he's arguing, except for maybe insemination. And so when people talk about women being inferior to men in the roles that men occupy in society, it's in the context of a recognition of the fact that women have contributions to human society that absolutely cannot be replicated by men. So while women could potentially take over the roles of men, men cannot take over the roles of women. So in other words, you got two roles for men and women. The women's role is so essential to society, it cannot be taken over. And so essential to being female, it absolutely cannot be taken over because men cannot gestate and they can't produce. Unfortunately, Loretta, you can't gestate it in a box. But so men can't replicate the roles of women, at least in terms of the reproductive functions of a society. So when they say women are inferior to men in men's roles, the idea is that it's said within the context of understanding that there is a role that women play that men can't occupy, just literally can't. They have no access to. And as feminists just don't even acknowledge this as a reality. So when you're in a society where women have a role that men can't possibly occupy, that is absolutely essential to the production of future citizens, and a society is a complete, if you don't have children, you're not going to have a future. And women occupy that role. There's no way they can be challenged in occupying that role. And the society says that, but women are less good at the roles that men occupy. Well, yeah, but they have an unassailable role that can never be taken from them. That doesn't mean that women are overall inferior relative to men. It means that they are inferior relative to the role that men are given, and is more socially ordained. I think is what he's arguing, and he's got a really good point, which is something that I think people should consider. If you got one group of people who have a birthright that cannot be taken from them, a contribution to society that cannot be taken from them, and cannot possibly be encroached upon by the other group of people, and you say that group A is inferior in the roles that are left over for group B, are you really saying that group A is inferior overall? No. And this is how feminism has viewed history. under the assumption that when people say, well, women aren't as good at men's roles as men are, they're saying women are inferior to men. That's ridiculous. Anyway, and I think that's his conclusion, that it is ridiculous to say that. And I'll step off the podium.
All right. Teal, do you have anything you wanted to say about that, or?
No, that's pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have
just
some.
You can't directly compare two things, so don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are so he has a couple of subsections, like headings, for other sections of paper. One is historical supposed misogyny is misinterpretation. I think that basically we just talked about that. Allison just explained. So, feminists try to make the argument for historical misogyny, and he's basically saying, no, that none of this is true. It's a misunderstanding of history. And it has a lot to do with, essentially, women's role isn't simply a socially constructed thing. It is a product of their biology, and men's role too. I mean, like before we had all these modern conveniences, there was an expectation. There wasn't just that. I mean, men were better suited for certain duties if we wanted to survive as a species, and women, they had biological functions, right? So this is what feminists would claim. Next, gender attitudes research shows no misogyny and actually phylogeny. Misogyny, formally defined as is a punitive male to female hostile or highly negative attitude. Gender attitude, as it were. Gender attitudes, both male to female and female to male, most recently have been reviewed and freshly examined by Dunham, Barron, and Bonaggi 2016 in a culmination of their own earlier work in various collaborations, looking at not just explicit, but more unusually, also implicit measures, and for the first time in literature across all age groups. Dunham et al. Found for boys/men no negative association with female whatsoever. Implicit contrast with explicit responses in being default, automatic, tapped by taking only immediate response, and to what is only indirectly evoked, so as to avoid either prompting or providing sufficient time to recruit other cognitive processes to modify or filter it. The usual methodology is to measure response latency to presenting a target together with other stimulus, the association between which dictating the reaction time. The closer seems the association, the faster will be the subject's response. Furthermore, with age, the same-sex positivity shown by boys on implicit measures decreases so much from adolescence onwards. Males show by comparison such a strong shift to a more positive attitude towards females that overall their respective consideration for the sexes completely reverses. So so basically he's got a citation. They have done the studies. They found that not only do boys tend to prefer, or they tend to be somewhat favorable towards women, as they get older they only become more favorable. And of course, once they're like in adolescence, then they're the most favorable.
Sounds about right. Just be aware of one thing. They're talking about implicit response and latency there. Part of me is concerned that is citing the implicit association test, which is pseudoscientific at best.
Yeah, it is citing the implicit association test, and I noticed that they completely memory hold all of the research around the fact that men have no implicit bias towards other men, and women have implicit bias towards women. Now I don't I don't know, as you said, Teal Deer, the entire implicit bias or implicit bias tests are probably hokum, but on the other hand, it's
even
pretty
the creators have confirmed that they are, because there's no possible way of knowing, because the way those tests are administered, you can cause the bias that you then find by just telling people this is a thing, this is a different thing, because it's basically done using controls and arrows left and right and whatnot. When you swap stimulus around, you effectively have to learn the stimulus the other way around, so you can effectively just be charting a learning curve for the new task rather than that. And then there's also the fact that when it comes to implicit bias, you're often looking at 0.00 something of a second average differences, which if you put it in time, the time it takes someone to blink, which is like 0.1 of a second, it's like if you put the differences in averages that implicit association finds into the term of blinking, your eye wouldn't even be a quarter of the way closed. Like that's little of a difference that it is, and it's like, based on this, we determine that you are racist or sexist. It's like, no, sorry, that's nonsense.
But even if you assume their work is true, they just completely memory hold what indicated that actually we're all pretty much pro-female.
Yes, because this is why I like to use bits of research like this against feminists and the social justice minded, because they think the implicit bias test is great. So I'm just like, okay, well, here's one that proves men like women and women like women, and here's another one that proves police are slower to shoot black people than white people, and all of that sort of stuff. And then suddenly, then you start throwing things like that out about them, which challenges their general worldview, and suddenly the implicit bias test becomes more questionable and not as accurate. It's like, it's funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah.
At least I'm consistent on my view that it's like, it's implicit bias, don't take it seriously, it's nonsense. But whatever.
Yeah, well, like I said, it does indicate something because they have memory hold all the implicit bias that shows that everybody pretty much has an implicit bias towards women.
Yeah.
But you don't need the implicit bias test to find out that everyone has because they have an explicit bias towards women.
Yes.
And you
that one's more important and relevant.
You can see it on all of the tests in which, you just ask a group of people, would you rather kill a man or a woman? Everybody's like, the woman. How dare you even ask? Go kill him now. People are they're explicitly pro-woman. You don't need to try to sneak this finding out of people. But anyway, continue, Brian.
Well, I was just going to add that the guy who wrote this is saying that he doesn't really trust the implicit part. In fact, he thinks that the reason why the implicit bias aspect, because it's supposed to measure both explicit and implicit, and apparently he has multiple studies, Skoronowski and Lawrence, Aidman and Carroll, Haddock and Zana, and was another one, and Carpenter, and they all produce similar findings, but he doesn't like the implicit part, and he thinks that it was included to essentially inflate the instances of misogyny so as to make it more lopsided, because what implicit means that they're basically reading the minds of people and jumping to conclusions, right, based on really sketchy evidence. If you just
0.006 of a second.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, yeah.
No, I get
it's interesting in that it's interesting in that it is measuring something that is objective. It's like, yes, there is an objective this difference between these two things, but it's like there is no way you have any idea why that is. Like, it could literally be anything.
Yeah,
it could literally be the vignette showed up once and the person blinked at the wrong time, and so that was like a fraction of a second that they didn't see it, and it slowed down the reaction on a couple. It can literally be that for the implicit bias test that causes that small of a difference.
Well, I guess he hates women then. You were too slow.
You blinked at the wrong time. Now you hate half of humanity.
Oh, then you gotta get out.
You're fired.
All right. So yeah, he does. The author of this paper does say that he doesn't sound comfortable with implicit aspects.
Good.
So he basically finds it in a couple of other replications of other studies, which I mentioned, and he talks about female but no male homophily. Homophily is the implicit reference for others of the same category to be considered fellow group members. So it's basically women's in-group bias towards other women, but males don't have that towards other men. So I'll just read a little bit of this. Work squarely on what is conceived of as an automatic in-group bias, as indicated in immediate response experiments, revealed that this was strong for women, whereas men had no preference at all for their own over the opposite sex. Nozick and Banaji, 2002, Richardson and Amati, 2001. This was quantified by Rudman and Goodwin, 2004, as a five-fold sex differential, a factor of 4.5 in the same-sex preference. Interestingly, by a purer measure of implicit attitude, in that the measure they employed entailed methods eliminating any confound with gender stereotypes. They further found a similar sex differential in respect of explicit measures. In explanation of their results, Rudman and Goodwin conclude that of women that, quote, they alone possess a cognitive mechanism that promotes own group preference, end quote. What? Wait. So they conclude that only women have a mechanism for in-group preference instead of men don't have an in-group preference, but it has nothing to do with the fact that they're missing something, but rather that it doesn't. I don't understand that. That's really weird. So men have no cognitive mechanism to preferentially consider other males as co-members of their group. Most importantly, this is what the study is claiming. Most importantly, the neutral data means conversely that men have no cognitive mechanism to exclude, or to that end, in whatever way, to diminish females in considering them as fellow group members. On the contrary, a man, unlike a woman, sees everyone, men and women alike, as being fellow members of any symbolic grouping, such as the whole workplace, company, university, or department, to which he himself belongs. You guys understand that so far? Anything you want to say? Okay.
His writing is really convoluted.
Yeah, I'd be more interested to read the actual part of that paper or part of that book. I want to know what mechanism he's talking about, because I have read some things like this, but I actually mentioned that at the beginning of the stream. But we're talking about things like serotonin system and dopaminergic system, testosterone system, and things like that. I want to know the exact mechanism that they're referring to, because studies that I'm referencing and things like that, I'm talking about specific. I'm actually naming the specific mechanisms, whereas this is vagary. I want the specific.
Yeah, I'm not so sure he's this is intentional vagary for vagary's sake. It might just be that he's.
It might just be that that's how the quote is in the book, and you can't really
or he
change
just writes
it.
this way. He just writes this way, and he really needed an editor. But I just wanted to look at that what they're saying about no cognitive mechanism for in-group bias among men. So essentially, men don't regard themselves as a group. So instead, they will, they want to have an additional group. So they'll be like, we're part of this team. We're part of this group of men working on this skyscraper, or we're part of this this regiment, or
it's identity saliency. That's all it is.
We are this Space Marine chapter versus
that Space Marine. So, but what's interesting about that is that would tend to explain why men create these cooperative identities towards a goal to a far greater degree than women do. And of course, these cooperative identities that are aimed towards a goal are highly productive. And so the only way that you would get women to do this too would be to remove the sense that they should identify as women, which, to me, that's an interesting thought, because you can't really these cooperative identities that men form, that they seem to have an instinct to form. So they don't take an identity from being men; they take an identity from these cooperative identities that they form together, and then you become part of that by serving the group goal. Of course, they're also exploratory, so they are creating things that don't exist before they create them. There's no way to get women into a position of being able to be part of that without teaching them the same psychological mechanism or enforcing the same psychological mechanism on them. Do you see what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
you can't.
Well, it's because women's value in this is inherent. It's because they're female, whereas male value is constructed based upon what they achieve. And this is why women have well, we're just women and that's good enough and that's what we have in common. Whereas men, it's like, no, we need to achieve something so that we are able to actually become men, as it were.
Even more, we need to develop a cooperative identity to achieve something, and that becomes our identity. That becomes our in-group bias.
Yeah, because that's more salient than we are just men.
Yeah, exactly. And the only way that women are ever going to be innovative and productive in the outside world, the way men are, is if they also had no identity. They didn't have they would have the urge to create these cooperative identities to have a sense of in-group belonging with other women, which is something I don't see happening.
Oh no, you have to basically say to women, you don't, your value as woman is not enough by itself. You must achieve more.
Yeah, it's actually, it's a negative. You'd have to not respect women. Mm-hmm. In order to develop women's individuality and their individual moral agency and their collective achievement, because a lot of the achievement that we pin on individual men is actually the achievement of the male identity groups that they belong to. I mean, the only way to get women into those roles is to basically not respect them for being women.
Take away their participation ribbons. You don't get a participation ribbon just for existing ladies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. All right, so the next section.
But that's misogyny.
Obviously, that's just hatred of women because
not celebrating women for everything they do, including like taking a shit,
and doing nothing and being awful.
Yeah, that's hating women. This is the reason, like the reason why I've been sort of challenging the idea of misogyny, because it just keeps broadening and broadening and broadening, and it erases actual like bad behavior. So, trying and failing to find misogyny in special conditions. With the failure to demonstrate misogyny and the literature clearly indicating at worst neutral and usually very positive attitude of males to females, there have been attempts to find or manufacture special conditions that prompt it. Having replicated Rudman and Goodwin's findings in a Japanese sample, 2009, Ishii and Numa Zaka, whatever, 2015, investigated males under threat. Numa Zakat, thank you. Investigated males under threat to their sense of self-worth when gender was made salient on their hypothesis that this would produce a negative association with women. So they tried to make men angry at women so that they could call them misogynist for reacting. However, they found no evidence at all of this, only an absence of positive association. Posing a similar but more specific scenario, Kazimovic and Kuznikov claimed 2015 claimed that women entering the workplace hierarchy pose a threat to males not generically but to those of lower status. However, critics Brown and Cotton 2015 point out that the authors use an inappropriate statistical analysis without which their data does not reach significance. In any case, the authors prefer an evolutionary explanation which is actually itself a false understanding of hierarchy. See the section below on supposed intersexual dominance, ignoring more obvious evolutionary explanation not entailing male hostility.
I like that. It's just in my mind, you know that meme of that guy with the stick poking things like, come on, do something.
Yeah, do a misogyny.
That to me is just
poking a stick.
Yeah, that to me is those researchers just poking. Come on, do misogyny, and
do
the guy's just
rape.
like, nah, women are all right.
Yeah. I don't want to detract too much, but I was talking to Lindsay about this concept before I did the show, and she was saying, and I don't want to misrepresent her, but she says that she believes that what we call, like, when there are legitimately angry feminists that claim that they hate men or they're angry with them, there is a kind of sexual thing going on. there. And one of the examples is that when this is the reason why, or maybe it can be a reason as to why feminists tend to like really like dominant, rough, if not damn near violent sex, and they ask men to do things like choke them out. And the funny thing is that because she said that she used to work with a lot of dudes, like on like outdoor kind of blue collar, labor work, right? And the men at work would talk about their experiences. You get the conversations, and sometimes they'd share their sexual experiences. And Lindsay was telling me that it was very common for these guys to be dating a woman, and they're gonna have sex, and the woman wants like extremely rough, borderline violent sex. Like they want to be choked, they want to be, they want this kind of, it's like the Gian Gomeshi thing, right? And these men are extremely uncomfortable. They're like, I don't want to do that. You realize how much trouble I can get into? Like the whole idea disgusts them. It turns them off. They don't want to do it. They don't want any part of it. And it's interesting because it sort of shows, like how men feel about women, even women that they're trying to please. And so they'll do it. They'll choke these women so that because they want to please them, but they do so at the cost of their own, arousal. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah, sounds about right.
All right. Okay, so it's sort of like I think that, I don't know. There's something for feminist women. There's something wrong. Sexism in its supposedly hostile form. So supposedly hostile, with the consistent failure to find any evidence of misogyny in terms of profoundly hostile male attitudes towards females, or even of a pro-male rather than a pro-female attitude. Then research to try to establish the existence of misogyny appears to have been distanced from this conceptualization and gender attitudes studies. This has been by employing a wider concept that can be conflated with and thereby misrepresented as misogyny, notwithstanding that any supposed manifestation under study would not thus be labeled if its appropriateness were to be directly considered rather than via the wider concept. Discussion has come to be in terms of the more loosely, if not ill-defined, notion of sexism. The concept of sexism had begun as being defined simply as a negative attitude towards women. So even though we call it sexism, it was meant to just be applied to women, just as in gender attitudes research. But it was later diluted to or any sort of prejudice or discrimination, and latterly an attitude by virtue of the target's biological sex, Lemirius and Rodriguez 2003, rendering the notion meaningless. As sexism can be inadvertent, non-malicious, and even benign, then its conflation with misogyny allows an unacknowledged broadening of the definition, thereby to misrepresent as misogyny a range of other phenomena. In turn, sexism can be qualified as negative rather than neutral or positive, to assume the mantle of misogyny by the back door, as it were, in effect sidestepping the literature on gender studies. In essence, gender attitudes have come to be seen as superficial, underlying, which is sexism. This would ignore that the very question of what is covert rather than overt has been substantially addressed in the research on implicit as opposed to explicit attitude. So, do you guys follow that? Essentially what he's saying is, okay, so for those of you guys who are essentially what he's saying is they change tactics, and what they do is they broaden their net, and they just try to prove or suggest or even manufacture sexism, which is not misogyny because it's milder. It's it's basically just defined as simply having a negative attitude towards women, which isn't like a hatred or fear. And then once you broaden it that way, then what they do is they sneak it in the back door, is how he describes it, and no pun intended. And then they will say, okay, now this sexism that we have implied in our work is proof of misogyny. So then they just make sexism into misogyny, and they use them interchangeably, essentially.
Yeah. It's also the fact that they have what would appear to be mutually exclusive or contradictory definitions, which is the ever-expanding part. That's where we get into things like benevolent sexism and whatnot. You like women too much, well, it's because you hate them. Like, can you imagine if in something like physics we did something like that? It's like gravity is like the force that body exerts drawing things towards it. Like, so when you drop something, it falls towards the ground. But also, things like a helium-filled balloon that goes upwards, that's also gravity. Because, of course it is, even though it's the complete opposite. And if something, if a feather gets carried horizontally in the wind, that's a different kind of gravity.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the term gravity doesn't really mean anything now. It just means anything moving any which way you can identify. Okay.
Maybe misogyny is the fundamental particle. It's the God particle. Everything. Misogyny moves in mysterious ways.
Indeed it does. You're right, Alice. It is the misogyny of the gaps, as it were. It's one of the fuck dark matter. That's yesterday's news. We're on this now. Okay, so a major problem, or the major problem, with the notion of negative, dubbed hostile sexism is the deeply flawed operational definitions employed in studies. The most recent sexism inventory by Tugis et al. 2015 is criticized by Tostain 2016, citing 3 examples, the first 2 supposedly denoting the hostile form. 1. It is difficult for a woman to work as a boss. 2. Men are incomplete without women. 3. Women, compared with men, tend to display a greater moral sense. The first, Tostain points out, is most likely to be actually an expression of support for women in terms of siding with them against what a woman might face in the workplace. It is difficult for a woman to work as a boss, right? That sides with women. The second is an acknowledgement of the importance of partnership between the sexes, an objective fact. Men are incomplete without women. And the gratitude towards, if not aggrandizement of women as partners. It also acknowledges difference between the sexes, also an objective fact, that Tostain picks up on with respect to the third example, which is women compared to men tend to display a greater moral sense, which he sees as being included simply because it is considered as essentializing women. These are the statements, by the way, that they're claiming are considered sexist when women compared with men.
Okay, so what is the respect women crap, if not essentializing women?
But respect women, isn't that a command for men to do something for women, and it's not necessarily defining women? Because it's respect women no matter what they do or how they act, and it's because they're women, right?
What that means that you are valuing something about women that they have no moral or personal control over. How is that? How is that not the same as saying women tend to display X positive quality? Like, okay, so you can simultaneously say women display no positive qualities because that would be essentializing, but I respect women. Like,
yeah,
okay.
I know. I don't think they know that. I think they just want what they want.
Yeah,
and,
it's so riddled with contradictions that I'd honestly, you'd either have to be incredibly stupid to believe this, or incredibly smart, or incredibly conniving.
Yeah,
I'm inclined to lean towards.
I think the term you're looking for. I think the term you're looking for there is midwit.
Yes.
You have to be someone who thinks they're very smart to pretzelize your brain like that.
Well, very smart but totally sociopathic, completely capable of manipulating the crap out of other people's instincts and drives and emotional biases, but you yourself don't believe a damn word of it. I mean, that's possible.
They're wizards, witches.
And then
witches, yeah, sorcerer. Because they use words to alter reality. It's a magic spell. You say misogyny, and or he's a rapist, and it's a magic spell that basically causes men to appear from nowhere to beat the shit out of that guy. It literally does, like D6s in damage. Maybe not literally. Okay. I'm sorry, Allison, you were talking.
No, I had concluded.
Oh, okay.
At Total Wine & More, we know what pairs perfectly with summer. Go ahead, test us.
What goes best with a beach trip?
This crisp rosé.
A pool party?
Try these craft beers.
Oh, you're good.
Wondrous selection, helpful guides, ridiculously low prices. Total Wine & More.
Been thinking about McDonald's all day. Can't get it off my mind. I can already taste it. Ooh, got my mind on my mouth and my mouth ready for some Mickey D's deal.
There's a deal for every moment at McDonald's.
Right now, get 2 of your favorites for just $3.50. Mix and match a classic McChicken, a hot and spicy McChicken, or a juicy McDouble. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with combo meal. Single item at regular price.